The child's bed lay empty, and the bedside candle had been snuffed. Marta's hand closed around the matches with a quick, sharp fear that went down to her knuckles. Fear drove her from the mattress and across cold floorboards before her mind had formed a plan. She crouched by the small bed, found the blanket folded wrong, and saw damp footprints smaller than Thomas' boots heading toward the back door. The smell of smoked fat and the faint tang of soot hung in the room. This immediate discovery set the problem plain. Edda was gone, and the light that marked her place in the dark had been taken. Marta struck a match with shaking fingers and cupped the tiny flame to the stub of the bedside candle. The flame flared, then failed. Her breath tightened, and she stood with the match between two fingers until it died. She herself, not to think of old stories told by the lantern keeper near the green. She told herself to move. Marta's thinking narrowed. Suspicion that someone had taken the child and stolen the light lodged in her throat and guided her feet. She ran a hand along the sill, felt the coolness of the glass, then tugged the back latch open and stepped into the lane. Outside, fog sat low over the cobbles. Marta's voice called, small. Edda, where are you? The voice carried 2 houses down and came back thin. A neighbor, Elias, was already at his doorway. He appeared with a blanket over his shoulders and a brass lantern in hand. Marta, Elias, what's wrong? Marta held up the matchbox and the wet footprints. Her jaw worked. She said, the candle's out, Elias. The bed is empty. Footprints leave the yard. The words moved like pebbles in a stream. They produced motion. Marta's suspicion widened into active alarm. Thomas joined them at the lane. He had his shirt half on, hair uncombed, a handkerchief clenched in one fist. He didn't ask who. He asked, Edda, where's Edda? His voice was blunt and flat, not a question. Marta pointed toward the lane, then at the stable. The footprints turn that way, she said. Thomas crouched, examined the prints and spat. The prints were damp and small. We wake the lantern keeper. He keeps stronger oil. He grabbed his coat and moved down the lane with Elias following. They roused the old lantern keeper with a firm knock at his door. He opened, face lined and the skin of his hands pocked from years leaning over smoky lamp chimneys. Old lantern keeper, it's Marta. Edda is missing, and the candle went out. The keeper, whose name was Jory, blinked and then set down the mug he'd been holding. He took in Marta's damp match, looked at Thomas and grunted. He reached for a spare lantern and, without another word, they moved out together. On the lane, more lanterns came alive. Neighbors stepped into the mist with blankets and heavy shoes. Thomas called out names as people joined. Elias, Jory, Marta, come this way. Voices were short. The group moved in a single line. Lanterns held low against the fog, so light cut the mist rather than melted into it. The sound of wet leather on cobbles, the scrape of skirts, and low murmurs filled the space. Musa, a woman from the next cottage, came with a child's cloak over her arm. Marta, did you hear anything? Marta shook her head and answered through her teeth. Only the candle gone. The answer was a small, bright fact everyone could hold. They followed the prince past the well and toward the row of empty stalls where the village kept spare hay. The lantern sputtered in a pattern none of them expected. One would burn steady, then gutter, then hold. Jory cursed softly and tightened the brass cap on his lamp. Elias's lantern dimmed twice and then brightened again without wind. Thomas clenched his jaw. Elias, check your lamp. Elias lifted his lantern and found the wick blackened and damp though his hands were dry. A low realization moved through the line. Something had been taking flame, or the lamps had been weakened by more than rain. Suspicion stiffened into fear. As they reached the disused stable, Marta found a small wooden horse half, buried in mud beside the track. She picked it up and wiped the muck on her skirt. The toy had Edda's initials scratched into the underside. Marta, Elias, look, soot on the straw there. He pointed toward the stable threshold where a black smear tracked inward. Thomas leaned closer and smelled the air, the reek of stale animal, but also a thin, bitter tang he could name. Marta's fingers tightened on the toy until the wood creaked. They pushed the stable door open together. The hinges complained, a long, dry sound. Cold air rushed out, and for a moment their lanterns fought the gloom and lost. Inside, one lantern lay on the floor, the glass sooted and cold. Footprints cut away beneath overturned bales. Marta's throat tightened and her hands went to her mouth. The group formed at the doorway. They did not enter the dark further. Jory's voice vibrated when he spoke, no wind in here, but the light's gone. Someone took it, or something took it, the words were concrete, an accusation without a face. A pale shape stood at the far doorway beyond the stalls. For a second all of them believed it was Edda. Marta's heart lurched forward. She heard herself call, Edda. The figure did not move. As they stepped closer, the lanterns closed and guttered. The small glow at the figure's hand died, and the outline blurred at the edges. Thomas lunged forward, reached for the child's shoulder, and the shape did not answer. Marta's fingertips brushed cloth and felt only empty air. The group froze. Silence pressed down and they heard nothing but a distant drip from some broken roof tile. The long shadow that fell from the doorway reached for the last lantern. Marta saw movement like a hand sliding over the lamp's rim. Her body answered before her mind did. She grabbed for the lamp and tugged. The lamp did not come free. Someone or something pulled the other way with force enough to tilt Marta off balance. A small hand yanked in the struggle. Marta's voice broke.
"Hold it! Thomas!"
Thomas shouted back, "Marta, don't let go." They traded 3 quick lines as they strained. Elelia's, "Push."
"Push!"
"Now!" They heved. The lamp slipped. The flame went out. When the light died, it did so with an abrupt hush. The sudden lack of glow made every surface equal and hard to read. Marta felt the wetness of the stable floor under her boots and heard Edda cry once, high, surprised, then silent. Marta lunged into the darkness by sound, hands out. Her fingers closed around a wrist and a small body collapsed into her arms. She felt the child's spine tense, a quick shudder. "Marta!" Edda whispered. "Marta, hold on. Edda, hold on." The child's hand was cold, and her breath came shallow. Marta's fear shifted now into fierce protection. She pressed the child against her chest and rocked. Thomas's knees scraped as he rose, lantern oil staining his coat. He grabbed Edda to lift her free while Marta searched the surrounding stalls with quick, heavy breaths. Edda's hair smelled faintly of soot. Marta stroked the child's cheek and counted the small breaths. "Edda, can you hear me, Marta?" Edda blinked and whispered. "The light went with me." It was gone. Her sentence made a new kind of clarity spread through the group. The child had been taken by something that stole flame as it moved. The lantern keeper, Jory, shook with an urgent motion and called, "We need oil on every bed tonight. Put extra wicks and keep them covered with glass when not in use." He moved with steady hands, his experience turning into orders. Martha nodded and said, "I'll fetch the extra oil from the press." "Thomas, wrap Edda." Thomas wrapped the child in the cloak Musa had brought and held her close. Musa pressed a hand to Edda's forehead and muttered, "Not warm. Not warm enough." The practical actions gathered around the fear and turned it toward precaution. In the dawn light, the family returned to the cottage. Neighbors carried extra wicks and jars of oil. Marta arranged curtains differently at the windows and set a lamp on a low stool by Edda's bed so someone could see the child's face without moving. Thomas sat with Edda and tied extra cloth near the hearth. "Thomas, Marta, we'll keep a lamp in the doorway tonight." "We'll watch the lane," Thomas answered. "Yes, Marta. We'll watch." The exchange was short and concrete. It set a routine of vigilance. Elias came by at first light and set the recovered lantern on the table. "I checked the lane after you left." Footprints vanished by the stable. There was a black smear on the stones as if soot had been dragged away. Marta listened and then asked, "Did you see any marks higher up? Any handprints on the door?" Elias shook his head. "No, Marta. Only the low tracks and the toy." The information narrowed their options. The thing stayed low and moved like a hand across the light. At breakfast, voices rose and fell with practical decision. Musa suggested they ask the smith to lay iron at the thresholds. Jory argued the iron would help the oil not go out as easily. Thomas worried aloud about keeping Edda near the hearth all night. Thomas, Marta, we cannot lock the child away. We must make the lane safer for every family. Thomas' reply came clipped, so we go out and face it. Marta looked at him directly, yes. We watched the lane together. The conversation ended on a decision rather than a speech. That afternoon, the villagers met by the green. They set jars of oil in covered baskets and tied bright cloth to their lamp handles. Jory taught how to trim wicks to hold a steadier flame. He demonstrated, hands quick and precise. Hold the lamp low, keep the glass clean, and shield it when passing through the mist. He Thomas and Elias to stand watch in pairs for the coming nights. Marta listened and agreed to stay with Edda at the cottage, while neighbors rotated patrols. The pattern of actions replaced raw fear with organization. A small twist appeared when a passing peddler, who'd been near the river the night before, reported a different image. He had seen a child walking with a lantern, but a shepherd's dog nearby had howled, and the child walked away into the reeds where the bank fell steep and wet. Hearing this, Marta's suspicion shifted. Perhaps Edda had followed a stranger, not some unseen thief of light. The group argued briefly. Marta, you re sure? Thomas, I found the toy at the stable. Marta, that could mean mischief from a passing child. Elias or someone leading a child away, Jory replied. The back and forth lasted 5 short lines. Each person repeated a name to keep track. The exchange forced Marta to hold both notions and test them. She chose to treat both possibilities as real. They would search the riverbank and watch the lane. As night fell again, Marta sat awake with the lamp set just inside the door. Edda slept, face drawn but warmer under Thomas' cloak. Marta's hands busied themselves with mending a torn sleeve, each stitch a small, steady ritual to fend off panic. Her fear had narrowed into a steady, watchful duty. When a soft footstep sounded outside, Marta rose and opened the door a crack. It was Jory with 2 lanterns, the glass shining like eyes. He nodded once and set one lantern on the threshold. They left a single, covered lamp outside and sat in pairs by the window. Thomas kept one hand on Edda's blanket while his other hand held the lamp's handle. Marta felt the pull of sleep but kept her eyes on the lane. At one point, she heard a scraping at the stable and flinched. Thomas whispered, "Stay ready." Marta tightened her fingers around the lamp's stand and listened. The scraping stopped. Nothing came of it but the pause. The tension folded inward and then eased slightly. Their night became a list of concrete precautions. Lids on jars, extra wicks, pairs on patrol. At first light, Edda woke but spoke little. She ate a spoonful of porridge and nibbled bread. She held the wooden horse and traced the carved letters with a finger. Marta watched her without asking questions, letting the child's small acts fill the empty spaces. A neighbor brought fresh oil and Jory inspected each lamp before they were put away. "We will change nothing about how we live," Marta allowed once. "Not to anyone in particular but to the room, but we will not let the light go unattended." The statement was tied to action. They moved materials, shifted curtains, and kept watch. The village had changed a small rhythm. The concrete decisions of the morning, more oil, cleaner glass, paired watches, were their answer to the night's theft. By the end of that day, the immediate crisis had been resolved in the sense that Edda was home, and the family had found ways to reduce the risk. The thing that had touched the lamps remained unexplained. Marta stood at the doorway and watched Thomas walk to the stable to replace a lantern glass. She called, "Take the sturdy glass this time," he answered. "I will." Marta, the last scene of the chapter is not a sermon, but a precise motion. Thomas picks up the heavier glass, fits it into the lamp, and puts the lantern where it can be seen from the lane. That deliberate act, choosing a heavier pane and placing the light where neighbors can watch it, closed the night's event into a clear, physical decision. It was an action that tied the family to the village. They would not leave light unattended, and they would stand ready to pull a child from the dark if needed. Marta burst through Thomas' doorway holding a guttered lantern, breath fogging in the doorway, and the word suspicion tightened her voice before she could shape a sentence. "Thomas, look," she said, and pushed the lamp into his hand so he could see the wax that had been pressed down, the wick pinched into cold. The action came before any thought. The house still smelled faintly of porridge and hearth smoke, and Marta's fingers carried the grit of the floorboard where she knelt before she ran out. Within those first steps she decided not to let this go as accident. That suspicion set the shape of the night and moved her feet. In the next few minutes Marta explained the immediate problem with quick gestures. She told us about a child's bed found empty earlier that evening in the memory that had not left her since the bedside candle snuffed out days before. That blank pillow lay like a note she could not read, and now the lantern confirmed another detail. Several homes had their light intentionally smothered. Thomas folded the lamp into the crook of his arm and nodded. "Which houses?" he asked. Marta named 3. She named the lane near the river where someone kept leaving small folded clothes on window sills. She named Aigen's cottage, where a soot, smudged handprint had been discovered. She named the smithy, where embers had been scattered across the floor. Each name tightened Thomas's jaw. Suspicion shifted into alarm. For Marta, the memory of the empty bed did not sit separate from these facts. It pressed at her decisions and pushed her out into the lane. They stepped into a narrow street that smelled of damp straw and river mud. Fog curled low over cobbles, making the lamplight look thicker than it should. Marta and Thomas followed a thin line of cold wax along the stone, small pellets like bone, white eggs crushed and spread. They moved without long speech, names clipped into quick questions: Agnes, Joran, Mill. Each call tested the lane. They found the folded blanket on a windowsill exactly where Marta had suspected. It sat neat and small, damp at one corner, and a child's pendant lay tucked within the weave. Thomas picked up the pendant with a thumb that trembled once, and then steadied. "This is Emil's," he said. "He never goes without it." His voice had a flat edge. The villagers knew him as patient, but tonight that patience narrowed into something like readiness to act. At Aigen's cottage, someone had left the latch undone. Aigens opened the door with a wholly practical movement and stepped back when she saw Marta. "Marta," she said. Her hands were already occupied with a shawl wrapped around a sleeping child. "What is it?" "Agnes." Marta held out the lantern. "They've been putting out hearths," she said. "Someone's been moving through houses, Aigens. The embers are scattered. There are handprints on the window." The words fell short of explanation, but they carried urgency. Agnes's face tightened. She looked at the window, traced a soot line with one finger, and spat softly. "A handprint, yes. I thought it was the cat at first." She set the child down and peered out. The motion of her hands was quick, practiced. She had spent many nights tending children, and soot did not frighten her. Who would do such a thing? She asked. Thomas spoke then, in short sentences. "We go door to door. Joran will check his forge. You stay with the children, Aigens. Marta, the river path light grows thin there. You go. I'll patrol the lane." The assignment came out of a need to act rather than talk. It was an arrangement that split danger into places people could watch. As they moved, neighbors drifted from their doors. Joran the blacksmith came with his cuff, still marked by coal. He listened with a hammer held in one hand, eyes narrowed, embers scattered. He said, "Sound like someone who doesn't care about heat. Or someone who knows what embers can do." He did not say what he meant, but his glance toward the river carried meaning. The villagers had learned that small things, embers, pendants, blankets, could lead to large troubles. They argued briefly about watch times and who would take what route. The argument was quick and full of names. "Thomas, Marta, you know the lane best. You take the lantern, I can go," Thomas answered. "No, you have to check the river." Marta shook her head once. "Emil's gone near the river before," she said. I will go, then I go with you, Emil's father called from a doorway, but Emil was not ready to step out. He moved between legs and held to skirts. That exchange hardened their roles. Marta and Thomas split the village into rotes. Agnes remained among the cottages, humming low, smoothing blankets. Joran locked his forge and set an ember in a stone, an old practice to keep a small warmth ready. The villagers' choices made small safety protocols. Window latches checked twice, children wrapped in extra cloth, embers banked beneath ash. Their actions were practical and defiantly ordinary. Marta walked toward the river. The path there narrowed and the lamplight grew fewer. At the water's edge, the reeds brushed her skirts and the bank squelched underfoot. She kept her lamp steady, fingers pressed to the metal so she would not let it bow like a small moon. The suspicion that had begun in the doorway had shifted now into a focused hunt. Marta listened for a rhythm that did not belong to the night. A figure stood by the willow, half turned away. Emil's small boots were pressed into the mud, and beside him a pale shape moved as if it were pulling the light. Marta's breath stopped in her chest. The suspicion became fear. She called Emil's name, Emil. She said so plainly that the sound split the night. Emil looked up with water on his hair and held an ember like a fruit in his cupped hands. He did not look frightened, only uncertain and small. Marta, he said. Before Marta could reach them, a slim retreating figure slipped further into shadow holding a dim ember. Marta stepped into the river to pull Emil back. The cold burned through her wool, and she felt the bite of water on skin. She grabbed Emil's sleeve and he slid from the other figure's reach. The three of them stood with mud at their knees, and the figure turned. Marta, who are you? The question came out sharp. The figure kept the ember low and spoke with a voice that rasped like someone unused to long phrases. I take nothing that will burn a house, the figure said. Only what keeps skin from freezing. Only what leads a child who is lost. That answer did not fit neatly into suspicion or accusation. It shifted the shape of the night. Marta blinked. Her mind catalogued what she had seen. The damp blanket on the sill, the pendant in the ash, the suit, smudged handprint. Her hands tightened on Emil's sleeve. Who sent you? Thomas called from the bank, voice sharp as a blade. The figure looked at Thomas and then at Marta. No one sent me, the figure said. I take what I can carry and I leave a mark so the hearth will be tended later. I mean no harm, Thomas laughed without mirth. You left embers scattered and children near the river. The accusation lashed out in short words. The figure's shoulders rose and fell with a quiet exhaustion. Emil clutched his pendant and spoke with the bluntness of a child. She gave me the ember, Marta. It would keep my feet warm. But then the light went small and then she ran away. The child's voice was plain. It gave the scene a focus that required action. Marta's suspicion pivoted into a puzzled anger. Why would someone lead a child? She demanded. The figure, who now let the hood fall back, was an older woman with a coat patched at the elbows. She smelled of straw and boiled herbs. Her hands were blackened, not from soot alone but from smithy. Like Mark's, I watched the ovens go cold and I found a boy sleeping near the quay, she said. The townsfolk do not see him as I do. I moved the embers so mothers would not wake to find ash gone. I carried the small lights to the shelter beneath the old mill. He woke and followed. I did not know this would frighten the village. Her words made a claim that did not match earlier suspicions. The twist changed Marta's immediate understanding. This might not be theft in the usual sense. Thomas stepped forward, voice clipped. You moved their fires. You left soot on windows. You took a child's charm. He held up the pendant, and the woman did not flinch. You call that protection. The rapid exchange became an argument of intent and consequence. Agnes's voice rose behind them. Let her say why, she said. We need to know. The villagers formed a ring on the bank. Light pooling around feet and faces turned toward accusation and explanation. The woman swallowed. She spoke with careful, small sentences. There was a fever in the poorhouse last winter, she said. Smoke made rooms stifling. Mothers buried children then to quiet the cough. I find those who wander. I keep a small ember to warm them in a safe place. I did not mean to steal joy or heat. Her words gave a reason, and the reason altered motive but not damage done. Marta pressed Emil close and felt his teeth chatter. She turned the ember in his small palm and saw the wick had been crushed, then gently shielded. That seal meant someone had tried to keep the light from spreading. Marta's suspicion turned into conflicted certainty. She believed the woman had acted, but she also saw why the woman might do so. The villagers needed an answer that would respond both to danger and to the woman's claim. They argued then in short, fast lines, so you take what you please. Thomas, sometimes people take for survival, Joran replied. Sometimes people make choices for others, Agnes. We cannot have hearths going cold because someone walks the lane at night, the back, and forth had within it 3 rapid exchanges where accusations met justification. The argument forced choices. Marta the woman plainly. Where is the shelter? The question was functional. It was not a demand for explanation, but a move to resolve the missing child. The woman hesitated and then pointed to the ruined mill a furlong downstream. Under the mill, she said, there are old beams and straw. I did not bring many. I only kept what I could hold. That reply made the next action clear. They moved toward the mill in a ring that kept a small distance. Joran led because he knew the approach and because his broad shoulders could look like authority. Agnes and Thomas kept watch around the perimeter. Marta walked ahead, holding Emil close by the elbow. Every footstep was its own quick sentence. At the mill, they found a narrow doorway carved into piled sacks. Inside, straw had been arranged into a small bed. 2 other children huddled there, pale blinking. A faint candle had been smothered into a stub, and a small pile of carried embers sat on a stone. The sight changed the argument again. They were cold, the woman said. I found them shivering. I could not leave them where wolves might be or the river might take them. I led them here because the mill keeps wind out. The villagers' faces did not soften instantly, but several actions followed. Agnes took off her shawl and wrapped a child. Joran found a dry cloth and rubbed small hands. Thomas knelt and checked the children's feet for blisters. The debate turned into triage. Outside, the wind scraped the mill boards, and Marta watched the woman's hands. They had been careful, measured, and the ash on the window in Agnes's front room matched the smudge on the woman's palm. Marta turned that fact over in her mind. The same trace confirmed presence but not malevolence. She felt an emotion shift, suspicion into reluctant empathy, articulated in small acts. Agnes drawing up a blanket, Thomas easing his posture, Joran stiffening then loosening his jaw. Then came a smaller, sharper reveal. Emil clutched his pendant and said, her name is Lies. She used to keep the kiln for Mr. Harrow before he died, the mention of Mither. Harrow, a man known for keeping children off the river during his time, made Marta pause. Mr. Harrow had been a steady presence in the village. To hear Lies connected to him changed how they read her actions. This was the twist. Lies was not a stranger stealing light, but a woman with a history of protecting small ones in ways the village remembered. A neighbor, old Tom Weller, muttered near the doorway, Harrow's kiln always had a spare ember. Lies kept it alive when he could not. She learned how to move it without burning the thatch. His voice slid between memory and present fact. For Marta, the new information altered the moral calculus. The theft could still be dangerous, but the motive had roots that made it more complicated. The villagers had to choose what to do. There was a short council of quick sentences. We watched the river. Joran, we explained to the mothers where their pendants moved. We decide a schedule for proper embers where they want tea be carried away. Thomas' suggestion was practical and immediate. Agnes suggested they take turns bringing a small banked ember to the mill so nobody had to walk in the cold. That plan made the woman's action less risky and put community care ahead of a singular unauthorized act. Marta felt her decisions press against the night. She wanted to scold Lies, and she also wanted to thank her for shielding a child's feet from cold water. She chose instead to keep her voice even and to set practical rules. Lies, Marta, if you find a child, bring them to Agnes or to me. Do not move hearths inside houses. If the mill will take them, tell us. We will help keep a small ember here, so you won't have to carry it alone. Lies nodded and wet her lips once. The villagers accepted a new arrangement, not with warm delight, but with practical measures. They walked back with the children. The lane felt rearranged by choices made. Door latches secured, small embers banked beneath ash, a plan to share watch duties. As they passed the windows, a smear of ash caught Marta's eye. She pressed her palm to the glass and felt the grain of the window trim. The smear of soot looked like a thumbprint in reverse. Thomas noticed her pause and kept his voice low. We will keep a watch longer, he said. Tonight we have Joran by the forge and 2 men by the river. They will not let a child go unseen. The promise was practical. It bound the villagers' actions into an answer to the night's events. Marta closed her hand into a small fist and then relaxed it. Suddenly she felt the day settle into the task they had chosen. Explain the night's events to mothers, replace missing pendants, and set a roster for embers. Her suspicion had shifted through alarm and clarity, and then into an uneasy comfort. That movement came out of doing rather than thinking. By the time they approached the threshold of Agnes' cottage, Emil was yawning and heavy with sleep. Marta tucked the child into his bed and smoothed the blanket precisely, making sure the pendant rested where she could see it. Agnes sat by the hearth and fanned embers Joran had coaxed from a warmed stone. The room smelled of broth and the air had the plain softness of people, slowly making things right. Marta lingered by the window and watched Thomas close the door. He left a lantern on the step, its wick banked and its glass clear. Marta traced the line of cold wax along the cobbles with one finger in the thought of later, making a note in the small map of streets in her head. She had acted because suspicion pushed her. She had learned more when she faced the figure near the river. The night's thefts were not random. They were choices made by a woman who had learned to carry embers without burning homes. They did not arrest Lies. They did not cast her out. Instead, they altered an arrangement and wrote a new rule into how the village protected its own. Agnes would keep the spare ember at her hearth. Joran would make sure a coal bank was ready. Thomas and Marta would alternate river patrols. Lies folded the blanket and left with a hard, set face that spoke of both relief and wariness. As the villagers finished, Marta stepped outside once more and ran a hand along the sill where the soot remained. She left her thumb there for a long breath and then pulled away. The last line of the night was small and concrete. A smear of ash on Agnes' window, a pendant returned to a child's neck, and a decision to keep watch until the embers could be trusted again. This was not a tidy ending. It was a set of choices that would carry into the next evening. Marta closed the door, and with a final look at the street, she set 2 lanterns on the step, wick tucked and ready for whatever came next. Marta pushed through the common hall door, with a guttering lantern in one hand and a small, shivering child tucked against her side with the other. Suspicion tightened her mouth as she swept the lantern across the long table and found a row of candles pressed low, their wicks pinched, and the wax blackened at the edges. Who did this? Marta, voice flat with urgency, and the hall answered with a sudden, uneasy silence. Within those first breaths she saw the stakes. Lamps gone out across the village, a child left alone, and the clear possibility that these were not accidents, but a pattern meant to stop people from seeing or moving when darkness mattered. Marta set the child on the bench and unwrapped the thin blanket. She moved with short, efficient gestures, tightening the cloth, cradling small limbs, checking the child's ears for fever. The child coughed once and then sat still, eyes wide. Marta's hands worked while her mind counted the facts she already knew. The bedside candle in the child's cottage had been snuffed earlier that night. She had grabbed matches with a hand that shook. And now 3 lamps in the lane had gone cold within an hour. Those facts settled into a shape that demanded an answer. Thomas arrived at the doorway with Jonas trailing him, boots scraping the threshold. "Marta, Thomas, what is it?" "The candles are out," Marta replied, holding the guttering lantern forward so Thomas could see the pinched wicks on the table. She slid the lamp into his hand. "Look at this wax." Someone pushed the wicks down. Thomas's jaw worked. He checked the lamp quickly, thumb on the oil well. He cursed under his breath when he felt the grit in the metal. Jonas stepped in, breath white in the lamplight. "Mine died while I was putting out the oven," he said. "The wick was bent." "I thought it was old." "Not old, Marta." Someone pressed the wick flat. Someone walked between houses and made sure the light would not last. Suspicion hung in the room like a scent that could not be ignored. It moved people from calm to a sharper edge. They spoke in short sentences now. Names came out. Thomas, Jonas, Lydia. They spoke as people who must make immediate choices. Elder Lydia's voice came from the shadow near the hearth. She had come in slowly, hands folded under her shawl. "I saw a shadow move past my window toward the mill, Lydia." And the hall turned toward her like a clock hand. It seemed to keep close to the cottages, not the lane. "I thought it was a stray dog, but it moved like a person bending to the doorways." "Lydia, where did you see it exactly?" "Thomas, by the baker's chimney, then toward the green," she said. Her breathing was steady. She spoke as one naming details to be checked. The exchange tightened suspicion into a map they could follow. Marta felt the feeling shift in her ribs from suspicion to a rising fear as they counted the extinguished lights. Fear sharpened her steps when she stepped back out into the lane to examine the doorsteps. She knelt and found tiny soot smudges on the stones and crushed bits of rushlight scattered in a neat line. She touched the smudges with a fingertip and felt the grit transfer to her skin like a small, accusing print. That print made the danger personal. Thomas set down his lantern and joined Marta on the stones. "These marks," he said, bending close, "they repeat." Someone moved between houses with a careful touch. Not clumsy hands, they must have worked in the dark to do it, Marta, which means the person knew the houses. Or they moved so quietly no one noticed. The 2 of them rose and looked at each other for a second, then without further speech split to check 2 directions. Marta toward the watermill path, Thomas back to his cottage to inspect his own lamps. Their coordinated movement was a small, decisive plan. At Thomas' cottage the oil well felt light under his fist. He probed the wick with a flick of a finger and found it flattened, sealed into a thin black crease. "Not carelessness," he said aloud. "Someone forced this." He struck a match, fixed the wick to a brown thread, and watched the small blue at the tip flaring into yellow. The light seemed fragile. His hands trembled just enough that Marta, watching from the doorway, laid a steadying palm on his shoulder. Her touch moved the fear into something else. Determination. While Thomas repaired the lamp, Marta moved down the alley following the crushed rushlight trail. The stones were rough beneath her boots. Each smudge repeated at even intervals. Each broken wick lay like a small, deliberate mark. She found a strip of child's blanket once, snagged and folded around a nail on the mill fence. Marta tugged it free and felt the damp in the weave. A smell came off it, a faint smoke and river rot, that told her someone had slept near the mill recently. The discovery moved a current of concern through her. It turned suspicion into an urgent need to find who had been using that shelter. Thomas returned, lantern steady now, and Jonas joined them near the green. Who would want to darken a village at night? Jonas. His voice carried anger beneath its steadiness. Someone who wants people to be blind, Thomas, or someone who thinks darkness keeps them safe from worse things. The words hung, and Elder Lydia's face tightened. She stepped forward and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of decisions, or someone who keeps watch under that dark for their own reasons, she said. Her phrase nudged them toward options that were not simply mischief but intent. They followed the trail together, 4 shapes moving under low lamplight, hands tucked into coats, breaths visible in the cold. The path narrowed between cottages, the lane turning into a squeeze of yards and low fences. Marta kept her eyes on the ground. Thomas watched every doorway. Jonas scanned the eaves. The village itself felt like a set of doors waiting to be tested. Marta's mind flicked back to the earlier night when she had found the child's bed empty and the bedside candle snuffed, an image she could not leave behind. At the narrow alley they found more signs. Burnt matches tossed into a ditch, a small pile of stones moved aside where a lock might have been examined. "Look here, Jonas." He pointed to a smear on the gate hinge that glistened like old oil. Marta crouched and touched it. Her finger came away with a faint brown trace. "They moved the latch last night," she said. "They tested doors." That fact changed the mood from search to accusation. Someone had tested access to houses. The trail led them to the mill at the river's bend. The mill sat with its wheel stalled, paddles stiff against the dark. They found the door ajar at a crooked angle and a faint singe on the threshold. Marta stepped inside and smelled the metallic tang of a small, recent fire. She pulled a length of blanket caught over a beam. Fibers came away on her gloves. She saw a child's threadbare shoe under a table. The discovery pushed the group's fear outward into a sharp, exposed moment. Someone had been living there with a single watched light. They moved inward together, voices low. "Marta, Thomas, go left. Jonas, check the loft. I'll take the floor." They split with short commands. The order of their movements showed they trusted each other's hands. Marta climbed a low ladder and found a narrow alcove where a single lamp sat on a crate, its oil well half full. Someone had kept that lamp trimmed carefully. A small, frail figure sat on a stool by the lamp, hands folded, and watching them with an expression that was not aggression but an intense, wary attention. The watcher did not leap. The watcher did not flee. Instead, they rose slowly and lifted their hands to show they had no weapon. "Don't hurt me," the watcher said in a voice that trembled, and then steadied with practice. "I only kept the one lamp. I watched the others go out so he would sleep safe." Marta took a breath and felt fear turn into a complicated mix. Anger, then something like pity. "Who is he?" she demanded. "Who did you watch for?" Thomas stepped forward. "Thomas," he said, naming himself in a sharp, short way. "Thomas." "Who are you?" The watcher answered with a name that ached. "A watcher. An old woman who sleeps by the river often. I keep one lamp because the boy sleeps nearby." Their explanation fractured the simple accusation. Jonas moved closer and asked the direct question. "Why pinch the wicks? Why break the lanterns?" "Because the boy cannot sleep with bright light," the watcher said, "because bright light would call him out, and I keep him hiding. If the village walked by with torches, they would see him. If they saw him, they would take him away." The sentence landed like a stone. The watcher's confession did not remove guilt, it complicated it. Marta felt the emotion shift again, suspicion melting into a hot, protective anger, then into reluctant understanding. She remembered how she had found the child's bed empty and the candle snuffed that same night. The two images fit together now in a way that demanded another choice. Hands spoke while words faltered. Thomas reached for the lamp and felt the warmth on the glass. "Who is the boy?" he asked. The watcher swallowed and named a surname that Marta did not recognize. "He was left by the river," the watcher said. "People he came from the road. I found him crying and I could not let them take him to the road again." Elder Lydia put her palm to her mouth. Jonas exhaled and then said, "So you kept him hidden and kept the lights out so no one would find him?" The watcher nodded. "I kept the lights so he slept. I kept watch so he did not wander. I cannot feed him much. I could not take him into my house. I did what I thought right." The admission complicated their anger and sharpened their choice. The group argued in short, blunt lines. "You endangered others. Thomas, Marta, we cannot have lights fail in the lane. Thomas, we must also think of the child." Marta responded. "Jonas, what do you say?" Jonas rubbed his jaw. His voice was low. "We cannot let lamps go out and invite thieves or animals. But I am not sure punishing this watcher helps the boy." The exchange ran 3 to 6 lines quickly, each line a strike of judgment or mercy. The villagers' voices clashed. Their words revealed differing priorities: security, compassion, order. The watcher cried then, a small, sharp sound. "He came to me sick and tired. I could not leave him. I thought keeping the lamps low would keep him from being taken by traders or men who think a quiet child is easy to sell." Marta steadied herself and stepped forward. "Show us the boy," she asked. "Bring him here, and we will decide together." The watcher hesitated and clenched the lamp tighter, as if the light itself was a bargaining chip. This moment became the mini cliffhanger. Would the watcher surrender the child to the villagers now, or would they flee with the lamp into the dark? They waited. The pause arranged the tension so that the next action mattered. The watcher moved with slow resolve and left the lamp on a crate, then returned with a small figure wrapped in a second blanket. The boy held his head down and clung to the blanket edge. Marta knelt and spoke softly while Thomas and Jonas watched the doorway. "It's all right. You're safe now," she said, and the boy's shoulders trembled with a sob that he held back. The watcher released a breath that sounded like a man exhaling after holding their breath too long. Lydia stepped closer and touched the boy's hair, checking for fever as someone who had done it 100 times might. The villagers formed a quick council there under the mill rafters. "We will not turn him out, Lydia. We will feed him what we can and watch him together for now." Thomas frowned. "We need to decide how to keep lamps from being ruined again. Someone has been going between houses. We must watch the watches." Jonas nodded. "We can set a rota. Marta, would you lead a watch tonight?" Marta looked from face to face. Her suspicion earlier had led her to follow a trail. Now suspicion was shaping into a plan. She answered briskly, "Yes, I'll take the first watch with Thomas. We'll all go in pairs." The decision moved the fear into an operational calm. They had converted suspicion into action. They left the mill with a guarded tenderness folding into their movements. Marta wrapped the boy in another blanket and handed him to Lydia to carry. The watcher stood by the lamp and looked at it for a long time, fingers tracing the rim. "You must leave it, Thomas. We can let you keep rules that endanger others." The watcher nodded and walked to the doorway. No one forced them. The choice the watcher made then, step back into the night or stay and answer to the village, was the kind of moral knot that shifted the group's mood again from blame to complicated pity. They returned to the common hall with the boy and the lamp, the village S-shape small and close around them. People came to the door as they arrived, faces pale and tired. They made a plan for a communal watch and for a fairer distribution of oil. Jonas volunteered to mend the most damaged lanterns before dawn. Thomas promised to check every latch and hinge. Marta arranged who would sit near the boy that night. The altering of roles showed the villagers acting on choices rather than words alone. By dawn the watches were set and people moved in pairs along the lanes. Marta sat with Thomas for an hour near the hall, lamp between them, talking in short lines about details. Who would cover the baker's back door, who would carry spare oil, and where the boy might sleep in coming nights. They spoke like people who had shifted from surprise and accusation into the steady labor of care. Marta felt the last emotion change soften into a guarded calm and an ongoing unease. She could not shake the sense that the cause of the doused lamps might be more than one watcher acting alone. Outside, the village breathed in a slow, measured way. The rescued boy slept with a breath that rose and fell small and even on Lydia's lap. Marta tightened his blanket and watched the street through a slit of dark. Thomas stood and peered down toward the mill, then returned with a soft, decisive step. "We will keep the watch," he said. Marta nodded and, with the small motion of placing a hand on the lamp's glass to feel the steady heat, closed her fingers around the night's decision. A knock sounded at the hall door as a final, concrete beat. The sound itself an event carrying news and a test of the plan they had just made. Marta hauled herself over the low stone parapet and caught the cloaked hand just as the man pressed the wick flat. The lantern's glass guttered, and a thread of light fell away. Suspicion tightened her throat before she had a thought. She grabbed the man's wrist and felt the muscles under the cloak tense. "Stop," she said low and hard. The man did not answer. He worked the wick again with a quick, practiced pinch. Marta's suspicion had begun earlier that evening, when she found the child's bed empty and the bedside candle snuffed in a way that left black at the wick. She had thought then that someone's clumsy hand had missed relighting. Now her hands smelled of cold metal and wet wool from climbing. The problem sat plainly between her and the stranger on the parapet. Lights across the village were being put out on purpose. That decision threatened children, hearths, and the fragile order that kept the valley safe. She held on. Her fingers dug into the cloak. Thomas's boots thudded up the bell. "Tower stairs, Marta," he called, breath fogging in the open air. He slid out beside her and shoved. The cloaked figure stumbled, slammed a shoulder against the stone, and a small carved token fell into Marta's palm before the man vanished over the roof edge and disappeared down the lane. Marta stared at the token. It was a small wooden disc with a soot-streaked face carved into it and a notch cut along the rim. The notch matched the tool marks she had seen pressed into the waxed ends of candles in the common hall earlier that night. Her hands did not stop shaking, but she folded the token into her pocket and stood up straighter. The immediate fear had arrived. If the extinguishings were deliberate, they could be coordinated, and coordination meant an idea and a plan. They ran. Marta kept the token held tight as they bounded down the narrow stairs and pushed through the tower door. Thomas took the lead. He kept glancing over his shoulder. He spoke in short bursts. "Which way?" he asked. "Down the green and then the lane with old hedges, Marta." Her voice had a tightened edge that made her own ears prick. They ran onto the green toward the lane, where the cloaked figure had gone. The lane was thin between thatched edges. A lamplighter's box had been overturned near a hedge. They found the first house with its lamp pinched low and the wax pressed down around a wick, exactly as Marta had seen before. A woman at the doorway, hands still wet from washing, held a child and blinked at them. Marta knelt and lifted the lamp without asking. The woman's eyes widened when Marta showed her the notch in the wax, and then the token. "I thought my lamp had simply gone out," the woman said. "I woke and it was cold." "Lina is frightened," her voice broke on the name. Marta heard the child snuffle, and then the child's small voice whisper, "Mama, the dark feels big." That line tightened Marta's chest with a new emotion. A protective anger that moved her hands. They moved house to house. Each lamp they checked had been deliberately pinched. Each household offered the same small, raw detail. The wick pressed down, wax pushed flat at the rim, a quick, single movement that would not happen by accident. A neighbor, Ida, came running from a lane with a lantern in one hand and a shawl over her shoulders. "Elderhan needs to see this, Ida." Her breath came fast. She kept saying the names of those she knew were likely awake and likely to help. At the common hall the argument began immediately. Marta and Thomas pushed open the heavy door and set the token on the table. Elderhan took it with fingers that trembled and inspected the carving by candlelight. She turned it over. "Rolf's mark," she said. The word landed like a struck bell. Anna, who baked bread for 3 households, slammed her palm on the table. "Rolf left the valley 3 winters ago. Thomas." He spoke quick, hard words that carried blame as if the name were a match. "He doesn't come back unless the suit draws him." Elderhan raised a hand. "Let us speak plain. If Rolf's sign is here, then someone used it. It may be Rolf or someone wearing his token. That changes who we suspect, but it does not change what we must do tonight." She the last part slowly, with the weight of an elder who had kept the accounts of oil and rationing for decades. Arguments broke out then, loud and crowded. Ida slammed her palm down and said, "We cannot simply sit and let them take our lamps. Who benefits from us standing in the dark? Who profits when one light is kept and the rest snuffed?" Her voice rose with sharpness that cut through the hall. "Oil is short this year," said Elder Han. Her voice did not tremble now. "We rationed more tightly after the last freeze. Whoever threatens to leave us without even that small warmth will force choices. Choices breed fear. Choices breed favors." The hall listened like a body preparing for weather. Marta's suspicion shifted. At first it had been a prick of distrust toward an anonymous hand. Now it widened into fear. Fear that someone wanted the villagers to accept leaving only a single lamp burning. She could feel the movement of the fear inside her. Her jaw tightened, her throat clicked when she swallowed, her fingers tapped the table until her knuckles hurt. Fear moved her to ask the practical question that cut through argument. Who would benefit from keeping one light? Ida answered by naming names. Merchants who pass through take less from a lantern-lit guide. The millers whose families sleep on the road pay tolls to those who mark the lane. A single lantern can be sold as a signal. Rolf used to clean chimneys for a far price and a secret word. Her mouth formed each syllable with a mix of anger and clarity. Elder Han, Rolf had debts. He might have returned to collect or to warn. Perhaps he was coerced. Perhaps he is here and in trouble. We do not know. Her words created room for another emotion. Doubt. Doubt pulled at Thomas. He frowned and spoke quickly. If Rolf were here, he would tell us. He is a man known to the children. We cannot kill a man in rumor. Thomas's insistence pushed the hall into a different motion, toward hunting for a person rather than casting blame. 3 of them, Marta, Thomas, and Ida, left the hall with Elder Han's reluctant blessing. They moved toward Rolf's yard at the edge of the village. The lane narrowed under hawthorn hedges. The yard lay beyond a gate that hung off one hinge. Tools leaned against a blackened shed. The air smelled of soot, wet straw, and boiling water from a kettle that still hissed. Rolf stood with his palms open on a low bench. He wore a shirt that was clean at the collar but black on the sleeves. Soot streaked his face from cheek to jaw like the strokes of a potter's hand. He looked small in the yard light. He did not make for an escape. Rolf's shoulders trembled. Rolf, Thomas choosing a voice that measured accusation and the possibility of mercy. Why did you place your mark on that token? Thomas. Rolf's eyes went to Marta and then to the token in her palm. He tried to speak and the words came in a ragged rush. "I thought I could stop it," he said. "They mean to keep one lamp, only one, and bring the token back if I managed it. If I failed, they would punish me where my children could see." His hands shook and he looked down. The confession shifted emotion again. Fear softened into pity for a man who had been pressed by threat. Anger curdled with regret in Marta. Her voice had a firm, flat edge now. "Who you?" she asked. Rolf swallowed, a man with a grey cloak and a voice that said there is a thing that moves in the valley when every lamp is down. He keep one and it will pass. He set a price and a threat. I could not leave the children in the road. I thought keeping one might spare them. He rubbed his face with a soot-streaked palm. I pinched the wicks because the man told me the single lantern must show to something else, something that comes when the whole valley sleeps except for that light. The light would be bait and the rest would be safe. I thought if I could give one light I would save the rest. I did not know what it would draw. Ida's mouth opened and closed. She nothing for a long breath and then pushed forward until she stood directly in front of Rolf. "You put the children at risk," she said. Her voice had a brittle edge. Rapid words followed. "You chose who gets warm. You chose who sleeps in light." She spoke with a cadence that matched someone who had been watching ovens go cold and seeing ration lines lengthen. Marta stepped between Ida and Rolf. Her hands were steady. "Ida," she said, naming her to soften the blow. "Rolf made a choice under threat. Threat changes hands. We must learn who gave it and what they wanted. The sentence narrowed the argument into a working question. It moved the group from moral outrage to a task. They decided to use the single light as a test. The council's plan was messy and dangerous. Place a single lantern on the green, leave it burning through the night, and hide villagers nearby in pairs to watch and listen. If something came for the lantern, they would see it. If no one came, the token might have been a diversion. Elder Han insisted on using trusted watchers, Thomas and Marta among them. She wrote down names and sent messengers to those whose steps she trusted. The choice of one light became a collective decision, a sacrifice of convenience for the chance to learn. At midnight they carried a lantern to the green and set it on a low post. Its glass shone amber in a pool. A small crowd circled at a distance. Marta's heart went hot and cold, and she kept checking the token in her pocket. Thomas stood near the hedgerow with Ida. Elder Han tucked a shawl tight and watched with her jaw set. The watchers hid along the lanes with muffled breaths. The village giant of sound reduced to the small noises of hands and the scrape of feet on grass. The night waited like a held note. For an hour, 2 hours, nothing moved beyond the ordinary sounds. A dog whining, someone shifting in their blanket, the far clang of a cart unhitched. Then a shape came. It walked with the measured step of someone who knew the lanes. It carried no lamp. The shape paused beneath the lantern and hesitated. Its head tilted as if listening. A small sound, metal against cloth, came from the shape as it reached into a cloak pocket. Ida, hidden behind a bush, swallowed, and a soft curse passed between her teeth. Thomas signaled with a prearranged scrape. The watchers closed in simultaneously. They moved from shadow to shadow in pairs, their breath held like a kept promise. When they seized the figure, it cried out and turned. The face under the hood was young and pale, eyes wide with a mix of surprise and terror. No, the figure breathed, please. It had the same small notch carved on a wooden token tied to a neck cord. The figure dropped to its knees and begged to be let go. It put me to it, the person said. They take the token and press the lights down. They keep the last light, and the thing will look at it and move on. They do it, or my brother dies. The voice broke. The watchers looked at one another. The arrest revealed a second twist. The person with the token was not Rolf, but someone used by the men in grey. The plan was wider than one chimney, sweep's debt. It included threats, recruitment, and the deliberate pressing down of wicks across many hands. The token that had been Rolf's mark had become a stamp used to order compliance. Elder Hannah's face folded into exhaustion and resolve. They bind the weak with fear and the tired with threats, she said. She spoke with the steady cadence of a woman who had read lists of debts and seen men broken by them. We cannot only punish those who were forced. We must find the men giving orders. We must break the chain. Her words moved the crowd into new action. Rather than simply catching the runner, they would gather statements, make lists of those coerced, and set watches until dawn. The watchers took testimony through the night. Some were honest and ashamed. Others avoided names by giving only the barest facts. Marta listened and recorded with a hand that would not sit still. Her suspicion evolved into a clearer resolve. Someone used the village's fear of the dark as a weapon. She felt the change like a setting of bones. She moved from suspecting a lone saboteur to planning a way to protect her neighbors. At dawn, the group returned to the green with the single lantern still unbroken. The watchers counted heads. No creature had come for the lantern in the way the men in grey had promised. Instead, the men in grey had used the lanterns as a means of control. They had forced choices and extracted bargains. The villagers had to decide what to do next. Punish the coerced, find the grey men, or arrange a watch that would deny them leverage. Elder Han proposed a practical, concrete plan. We will set signals through the lanes and appoint watchers in pairs. We will post someone by the mill and someone by the ford. We will share oil from the stores so no one household is left to choose. We will take the token to the valley steward and demand a guard. each item as if counting the steps of a path. Rolf stood with his hands empty. He had called names to the council and confessed where he had left an old debt. He offered to clean chimneys for free for the month to repay the fear he had caused. Ida arranged schedules and lists. Thomas went with Marta to inspect lanes for places to hang spare lanterns so no single house would be alone. Each practical motion came with an exchange of labor, apology, and small gifts of oil that would be split among the neediest. The twist that pointed most directly at change arrived in a question Elder Han posed aloud. Who kept quiet while we argued? Who in the town answered the men in grey with tokens and threats? She let the question rest. Her eyes traveled slow and steady across faces. No one spoke. Then a lad who kept accounts for a traveling trader stepped forward and spoke of a man in a grey hood who had asked for a watchword and offered coin. He drew a map with his finger on the table and traced the route that had been taken the previous week. The tracker's finger trembled only slightly. He walked the lane with the hawthorn, then the ford. Then he stayed near the mill for 2 nights, the lad said. Elder Han nodded. The new information changed their plan again. They now had a pattern, a set of places to watch, and times when the grey men likely came through. The choice of one light had revealed a network that relied on hunger and fear. In the days that followed, the village set watches in rotation, shared oil, and refused to let a single lantern be the only source of guidance for any traveler or household. Rolf worked at every chimney and washed at every floorboard he could reach. Ida and Marta oversaw the distribution of the spare oil that Elder Han had negotiated from the steward. Thomas patrolled with a sober face, showing older boys how to tie knots in rope and how to make a lamp shield that prevented a lamp from being snuffed easily. By midweek they had found a grey garment caught on a bramble near the ford. Inside its hem was a scrap of cloth stamped with the same notch pattern as the token. The scrap led them to a small cabin where a labourer had taken in cloth and coin. The labourer, when confronted, named a man who travelled with a cart full of sacks. The man's name was given reluctantly and with fear. The villagers moved with the resolve that comes after a decision. They would not wait for the men in grey to choose whom to punish. They would prevent the pattern from continuing. They met the cart at the edge of the lane and spoke plainly to the traveller. Thomas stood with his hands visible. Marta spoke for the village and did not permit a single theatrical speech. "Why did you put men in cloak and token them?" she asked. Her voice carried the straightforward edge she had used since the bell tower. The traveller flinched and then told of a ring of men who had been promised tolls if they arranged single lantern nights in valleys to make travellers pay more for safe passage. He named a price. He named the man who paid them. The list of actors widened until it was no longer a mystery that fit in a single palm. They returned to the hall with names and with the brittle comfort of actual things to do. Elder Han wrote down the names and sent word to the steward. The steward came with 2 guards and a jolt of official presence that made some villagers sharp and others relieved. The men in grey who had set the pattern of fear were rounded up in the next 7 days. Not by violence, but by the steady refusal of the village to bow, and the careful lists Elder Han had kept. When the men were taken, some denied everything. Others admitted to threats. Some they had been hired by a traveller who thought the valley useful as a route to tax the frightened. The steward arranged for a public penance. Those who had taken tokens and forced choices had to stand before the green, while the names of those they coursed were read aloud. They were ordered to carry oil to the houses they had wronged and to pay for new wicks. The restitution was precise, measured in ounces of oil and hours of labor. It was practical. It was a kind of justice that could be counted at a table. Marta watched the men carry a heavy basket of oil and walk down lanes they had once watched from the safety of their cloaks. She felt no triumph. She felt the slow settling of a body that had held tension through a long night. Her suspicion had begun the story, fear had pushed her to action, doubt had widened their thinking, and resolve had driven them toward a practical plan. The last emotion that settled over her was a small, careful compassion for a village forced into hard choices. In the quiet that followed, Jenna the baker returned a child's toy that had been left by a runner. Thomas helped Ida mend a lantern shield. Elder Han counted lamps by the door and gave a ledger line to Marta to keep. Rolf came to Marta's cottage and set to work on the chimney he had promised. He paused when Marta's child Lina came to him and held out a small wooden horse. Rolf knelt so Lina could hand it to him. He took the horse with a slow hand and then looked at Marta. I thought a single light might save you all. I was wrong. I am sorry. He showed the apology by washing chimneys and by staying late to mend what he had helped break. Ida oversaw his work assignments. Thomas supervised the repair of the lamp posts so wicks could not be easily pinched. At dawn a week later, Marta stood at the low window of her thatched cottage. She watched Thomas across the lane bolt a shutter. She watched Elder Han walk with a ledger under her arm toward the common hall. She watched Rolf's suit drying on his sleeves step into a house to fix a hearth. She felt the village breathe in small steps. Lists being made, lamps being shared, a guard posted at the ford at night. The choice of one light had become a choice to refuse that bargain. Marta tucked Lina into bed that morning and read a single short line from a prayer Lina liked. Lina's eyes drooped in trust. Marta kissed the child's hair, checked the latch on the window, and left the lantern by the door with the glass wiped clean. The lantern was not the single light from before. It was one of many that would be kept by agreement and rotation. She closed the door and, for a moment, sat on the threshold and listened to the small world of her home. The kettle cooling on the hearth, the soft creak of a floorboard, the low breathing of someone asleep. The village had not returned to the perfect safety they had once assumed. There would be other threats. But they had moved from fear to plans. Marta's hands still carried the memory of cold metal and the weight of the token, but they also carried a list. Oil shared, watches scheduled, names written, chimneys to be cleaned. The last line of the night was a simple, concrete act. Marta extinguished her own bedside candle briefly and then relit it with the spare oil from the common store. She set the wick straight with a steady finger and watched the small flame rise. She did not make promises to herself. She made a small, visible thing for her child and for her neighbor. That was the choice she could keep. Outside, on the lane, someone was already trimming a hedge. The watch by the ford was shifting quietly. Elder Han called out a list of names so the labor could be shared. Marta walked to the door and looked out. The dawn washed the roofs in a pale amber. She turned the token over in her palm and then folded it into her apron. She spoke the names of those she loved aloud: Lina, Thomas, Ida, Elder Han, and then closed the door and carried the lamp to the kitchen, where she set it among other lamps. The final sound was not a speech but the low, practical clink of metal against metal as she set the stand and tied the wick in place. The concrete finality of the chapter was in that action. Marta set a single, properly trimmed lamp on the kitchen table and locked the cupboard where spare oil was kept. Then opened the latch on the window so a thin line of morning could reach the room. The village had chosen to keep many lights, not only one, and to make its safety a matter of sharing and labor. That decision, made through fear, planning, and a reluctant justice, had rearranged the village's night. The lamp burned steady as Marta sat down to list the names of households that would receive oil that week. She wrote each name with a calm hand. The last sentence she said aloud was not a promise but a task. Thomas, meet me at the ford at 7. We will set the first watch shift, Thomas answered from the lane. I'll be there. The door closed softly behind them.